Hello everyone and welcome back. We are now in week 3 of our series, Small Church, Big Vision. Now that means we're halfway point of our series, right? And so I hope that the last 2 weeks have been very encouraging, has been very inspiring, as well as empowering. Now we need to understand that health starts at the top. Healthy churches need healthy leaders. So healthy leadership, healthy systems, healthy structure, all equate to a healthy church. Now, the healthy church, no matter the size, whether small or big, have the incredible ability to make great impact for the kingdom of God. Now, today, what we're going to do is we're going to join Karl Vaters as he shares with us the 3 ways your healthy church can be more effective and how we can embrace our uniqueness.
Hi again, I'm Karl, and I'm a small church pastor. And in this session, we're going to talk about 3 ways your church can be effective at its current size. Now, I don't know what the size of your church is, obviously, but I know it can be effective at its current size because I've seen effective churches of every size you can imagine, from literally 2 or 3 all the way up to 20 or 30,000 and bigger. Small churches can be healthy and effective, and that includes your church. So, in this session, we're going to look at the 3 main issues that we need in order to do that. I'm going to give you all 3 of them up front, and then we'll look at them one at a time. Here are the 3 main things that we need for any church to be effective at its current size. First of all, you have to realize that you can be effective. No church can be effective if you don't think you can be. Secondly, we need to discover how small churches function differently from big churches. Not better, not worse, just differently. It'll help us to understand how we can be more effective when we understand some of those differences. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about how to understand and use the unique DNA of your small church for God's glory. So those are the 3 pieces we'll look at. Let's start with number 1, realize your small church can be an effective church. Now, in our last session, I talked about some of my story, how I ended up in a situation where, because I didn't think our small church could be effective, when in fact it was already being effective at its current size, I ended up in a spot really burned out and almost leaving ministry. Well, I went to my 40 days off. I went to seek some counseling. I got some help. I started getting pointed in fairly much the right direction, but I was still kind of in that place. One of the things I've discovered about a turnaround is this. At first, when you turn around, you're still in the same spot. Right? If you've ever gone through a church turnaround, like emotionally, for instance, if you're going downhill and you turn around, you're in the same spot, but the difference is you're facing in the right direction, and direction is everything. But at first, when you make a turnaround, I actually tell people like this when in recovery groups, I tell them, you give your life to Christ, you are going to be in the same spot you were before. If you owed money before, you're still going to owe money now. If you've got a court date coming up, you're still going to have a court date coming up. Coming to Jesus doesn't get rid of your court date or get rid of your debts, at least not the financial ones. So what's the difference? The difference is now you're facing in an upward direction. Now what you do serving Christ will go forward. Same thing happens with church and pastor turnarounds. So I went through this turnaround. It was a turnaround of heart, of mind, and of attitude. So I was still in somewhat the same spots, but at least I was facing in the right direction. But some of the old things were still hanging on, and I still had some of them to work out. So anyway, I went back to the church. They accepted me back, first of all, which is the first great blessing. And then I went to our annual denominational council for Southern California that year. And I went there, and I've been going there for every year for the entire time I've been here, for decades at that point. And every year, the head of our denomination for our region would get up, and every year he would give the state of the denomination report, as he should. And every year, a part of that report was numerical. There were this many salvations, this many churches planted, and so on. So part of the report was numerical, as it ought to be. And part of the numbers that were given out every single year was something like this. Over 90% of our churches are under 200, and over 80% of our churches are under 100. Every year that was presented. It was always, slightly different maybe, but only by a percentage point or so. It really didn't change through all those years. And so every year I would hear from a person who I knew and respected and I knew was looking out for me and for my church. And every year he'd get up and tell us 90% of our churches are still under 200, 80% of them are still under 100. And every year the next sentence was always some version of, we need to figure out how to fix this problem, or here's our program to figure out how to fix this problem. But every year it was presented as a problem. So every year as I would listen to it, my first response every year was, oh no, I'm a part of the problem. This person who's leading our denomination, who I respect, who I've really gotten a lot of help through over the years, is telling me that the size of my church is a problem that must be fixed. And so for years I sat there, and it was just one of several things that kept feeding, negative thoughts and negative emotions and negative attitudes into my soul. He didn't realize it. We've had conversations since then, and we're good. But that was part of the process that I was going through. And then this year, I'd gone through all the counseling. I'd taken that time off. I'd come back. I was still kind of in a bad way, but at least beginning to think about forward motion. And I was sitting in that meeting, and the same thing happened. Report came up, same report, same percentage. 90% of our churches are under 200. About 80% of them are under 100. And that year, something inside me snapped. Instead of responding with, oh no, I'm a part of the problem, I want to get my church bigger so I'm not part of the problem anymore. Instead of, oh no, my response that year was this. So what? So what? I don't care anymore. What I've learned since then is whenever you're talking to someone who's going through difficulties and they say, I don't care anymore, what's actually happening is they care so much they can't even admit it to themselves anymore. I don't care anymore is actually a really dangerous statement for most people to make. And that's where I was. I just went from, oh no, to so what? Okay, fine, our church is small, so what? We got a lot of small churches, okay, fine, so what? I don't care anymore. But I'm stubborn. So when I ask so what, I actually want to find out so what. So I did the research. What I discovered was this: no matter whether it's a denomination or a geographical region or any conglomeration of churches by whatever way that they network together. If you take a network of churches and you find out how many small churches there are compared to large churches, those percentages actually tell you nothing about the health of the churches in question. And here's why. If that group of churches is going through renewal and revival, what's one part of renewal and revival? It's planting churches, right? A group of churches that's in renewal and revival will have planting churches as part of that renewal and revival. And when you plant churches, what size do they tend to be? Small, right? So when a group of churches is in renewal and revival, and as part of that renewal and revival, they're planting more churches, that means they're adding more small congregations to the group, which means the percentage of small churches to big churches remains high. Likewise, if that group of churches is in decline, then you're going to have diminishing attendance in those churches, and so the number of small churches to large churches remains high. Almost universally, with only one or two small exceptions, throughout the 2,000 years of church history, if you take any region, any group, any network of churches of any type, you are always going to find a massive number of small congregations and a very small number of very large congregations. And it doesn't matter if those groups that are in decline or in revival, there's always going to be a much higher percentage of small churches to big churches. So that was part of the so what that I started thinking about. And as I discovered that and I realized, okay, wait a minute, I'm not part of a problem here. I'm part of a historic normalcy, right? That's just simply the way things are, which, by the way, if your church is small and you're trying to figure out how to fix it because it's small, here's the deal. The fact that your church is small doesn't mean your church is broken. It means your church is normal, and I don't fix normal. Now, there's nothing wrong with it being big either, but small is pretty normal, has been for 2,000 years and counting. So I went through that so what, I found that information out, and then it made me go to a third question. So my first response to this percentage of small churches was, oh no, I'm a part of the problem. My second response became, so what, I don't care anymore. Then when I discovered the so what, here was my third response. Now what? Okay, our church is small. Now what? There's a whole lot of small churches in the world. Now what? What are we going to do about this reality? There's a saying in business that the first job of the leader is to define reality. And that's what happened for me when I did that research. I defined the reality of not just my church and of the churches in my region, but really of the global church for 2,000 years, that there's a whole lot of small for 2,000 years and counting. That is a part of our reality. So my question then after discovering that reality is, okay, now what? What are we going to do with that reality? While I was going through that season, This was back in the day when we couldn't Netflix everything. You had to actually change the channels. Anybody under 40, ask somebody over 40 what that means, and they'll tell you. But we had to change the channels. I'm going through the channels, and one day I came across Apollo 13. And, great movie, so I thought, I'll watch it again. And for those of you, most of you have seen it or at least familiar with it. It's a really very well done movie about a historical event. What was supposed to have been the third moon landing, Apollo 13, partway to the moon, they get damage to their spacecraft. And so what was going to be a discovery mission on the moon becomes a rescue mission. They're trying to get these 3 astronauts alive, safe at home alive. And in the movie, they go through one problem after another, all based on reality. And at one point, they rush in to Command Central in Houston, and they say, we're running out of air filters. And if we run out of air filters, the 3 of them are going to die. And the engineer looks at him and goes, how did we send them up without enough air filters? He says, well, we've got enough, but some of them are in the landing module. And since they didn't land on the moon, they didn't use the filters in the landing module. To which the head at Houston looks at them and goes, the landing module is still attached. Have them go over and get them and bring them back. To which he goes, we did. They're a different size and shape and they won't fit. To which in the movie he responds, tell me this isn't a government program. Right? And then he says, okay, we got to figure this out. So the very next scene in the movie is this. A couple engineers take a couple really large boxes of material and they dump it on a couple huge tables in front of all the other engineers. And then essentially what they tell them is this. Everything that's on this table is everything that's on Apollo 13. So using only what's on this table, you have to figure out how to make this fit into this or they die. And the problem is there's not a single thing on that table meant to do that job, and the clock is ticking. But that's the mission. And of course, they succeed at the mission. But as I was watching that, especially during the season that I was going through and thinking about small churches and what does a healthy small church look like, I thought about this big mess on the table. And so you've got this mission, lives are at stake, the clock is ticking, you've got this material on the table, none of which was designed to do the job that you're assigned to do, but the mission is still the mission. And then I thought, you know what? I don't know of a better metaphor to describe what it's like to be a small church pastor than that. Right? I mean, how many of us have looked around at the resources in our church and went, really? This is the mess you've given me, Lord? Yes, that's the mess you've got. And the mission hasn't changed and lives are at stake. Get the job done. You want a picture of what it's like to be a small church pastor? That's the best picture I know. So that's defining reality. For most of us, that's defining reality. Now you can push back against it. You can wish it wasn't the case. But if that's your reality, that's your reality. The question then becomes, okay, now what are you going to do? Right? There was nobody in that room for Apollo 13 that looked at it and went, oh, we can't do it. We're out of here. We're going to take lunch. No, they figured it out using stuff that was not designed to do the job with the clock ticking and with lives at stake. And here's the deal. Those are the kinds of situations they make movies about. They don't make movies about a team that's got unlimited resources and unlimited times and low stakes. Who wants to watch that movie? I don't. I don't know that I even want to live that life. I'll use a little less pressure, thank you. But you want to have you want to have a challenge, and that was their challenge. Now, there's another saying that's really common in business today, and many of you have probably heard it said from a leader or somebody like that, where they say, get the right people on the bus. And what they mean when they're talking to other leaders is this. When you're putting a leadership team together, you've got to make sure that you've got the right people in the right tasks on your bus that are working together properly. Otherwise, the whole team can fall apart. It's actually a really great principle. It was made popular in a book called Good to Great by Jim Collins, written maybe 10 years or so ago. It's a really, really helpful principle. The challenge in the small church is this. When you look around at a small church and you hear the phrase, get the right people on the bus, for the average small church pastor, the reaction isn't, oh yes, I'm going to go make sure I get the right people. The average small church pastor's reaction to that is, get the right people on the bus. These are my people. This is my bus. Like, you're acting like I have choices here. I have an Apollo 13 table mess. There's no right people. There's no right bus. This is what I have to deal with. This is where we get to the spot I was talking about earlier about, excuse me, this is my church and why is my church so weird? One of the reasons small churches are so weird is because we have this Apollo 13 table mess that we got to do, but the mission hasn't changed and lives are still at stake. Now, after that, though, I've got some really good news for you. It's going to sound like good news at the front, and then it's going to sound like bad news at the end of it. So let me just warn you before I give the sentence. Here it is. People will come to small churches. Yay! but they won't give up quality to do so. Oh. Now, why is it that the front half of that sentence sounds awesome and the back half of that sentence sounds terrible? Because most of us in small church leadership have a wrong perception about what a quality church looks like. And the reason we have a wrong perception about what a quality church looks like is because we are taking our cue in a Starbucks-sized church from our last seminar session, and we're taking our cue from the IKEA-sized churches around us. And quality in a massive IKEA store looks different than quality in a small Starbucks shop. They're both quality, but quality looks very, very different. So in a smaller congregation, we think, oh, people aren't going to come to the church because it's too small. That's simply not true. And the more the new generations are coming along, the less true that is. Smaller, newer, like millennials and well, not Gen X, they come before the millennials, but the millennials and the Gen Z and the generations that are coming after that, they really want a smaller, more intimate setting more often. And so even if they go to a large church, they're more likely to say, we also want to go to a small group where we get to know people. Pastors of larger churches like Rick Warren constantly says we need to grow larger and smaller at the same time because that dynamic is recognized in every healthy big church that I'm aware of. So people will come to small churches. That's great news. They won't give up quality to do so. That sounds like bad news, but it's not. And here's why. Because quality looks different in a small church than in a big church. And this gets us to point number 2. So far we've been talking about point number 1, realize your small church can be an effective church. Now we go to point number 2, discover how small churches function differently from big churches. This is where I had that stop thinking like a big church moment that we talked about in the last session, where I started asking, what does a healthy small church look like? And a healthy small church looks different in a whole lot of ways than a healthy big church. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you this little Venn diagram. I came up with a Venn diagram illustration a few years ago, and on the one side you've got a circle that is big church essentials. On the other side you've got a circle that says small church essentials, and they overlap a little bit in the middle. I came up with this illustration a few years ago because for years I looked for a simple visual way to show people the differences between big and small churches. Not to pitch one against the other, but to understand the leadership styles and differences that you need to make as a church is bigger or smaller. But almost every diagram that I saw was either stair steps or a ladder. So it would be a church of 50, a church of 100, a church of 500, 1,000, and so on. And anytime you see a visual that has stair steps or a ladder where small is on the bottom and big is on the top, what does that subconsciously tell you about the quality of the ones on the bottom as opposed to the quality of the ones on the top? It subconsciously tells us these are bad, these are good. A ladder is for climbing after all, right? Now, that may not have been the intention of the people who came up with those illustrations, but that is how it hits people subconsciously. So I wanted to come up with a simple illustration that would show us the difference between big and small without it looking like better or worse. And the Venn diagram does that. So if you look at the Venn diagram, you see big churches, small churches, and here's how it works. There will always be an overlap in the middle because there are certain things that every single church has to do in order to be called a church. I'm going to say, studying the Bible is pretty important. Believing that Jesus is the way to salvation. These are things that are essential for every single church, right? So there's always going to be an overlap. But when it comes to the leadership of a congregation, the bigger the church is, the more those two circles are going to overlap. The smaller the church is, the less those two circles are going to overlap. So it's not a matter of lower or higher, worse or better. It's a matter of less overlap or more overlap. And that's all it is. So when you do that, what you understand is that many big church principles don't translate well into a small church context. But what we do quality-wise is we look around at the big churches near us. In fact, it's often written that way where people will say, I want to check out what a healthy church looks like, so I'm going to go to the big church nearby. And that's great, but let's also go to a couple small healthy churches to see how they function as well. But most of the time we don't even think that way. So we've got this in our head that big equals quality. And that's not always the case. There are a lot of small churches that have great quality, and there are some big churches that are sick on the inside. We all know that, but we seldom acknowledge it. But what we do is, in a small congregation, we look at the huge church and we think, I've got to do it that way. but it doesn't translate. Most of it doesn't translate over. And the smaller your church is, the less overlap there is between those circles and the less helpful they can be. So you might hear a big church pastor talking principles and you might think, oh, that's great, it worked there. But you have to ask yourself, how much overlap does that circle have with my circle? It's not that what they're saying is wrong. It's right. It worked for them. It'll work for some other churches as well. But it may not work in my context because of my size, so I have to understand the overlap. So you've got the two overlap. You've got big church principles, you've got small church principles. In addition to that, I'm going to add something to this diagram. I'm going to add a bunch of little dots. I call them my Wonder Bread dots. And you'll see why when you take a look at them. And I want you to see that there are three characteristics to these dots. First of all, they're all different sizes. Secondly, they're all different colors and shades. And thirdly, and most important for our conversation today, is this: they don't touch each other. And here's why. While the circle on one side stands for what all big churches have in common, and the circle on the other side stands for what all small churches have in common, these little dots inside the big church circle stand for the unique DNA of your congregation. So they don't touch because one congregation has a different DNA than a different congregation has. And this is the part of your church, as we joked about earlier, why your church is so weird. Here's the inverse correlation. The smaller your church is, the larger your unique DNA circle is. So small church pastors actually have to master three sets of principles. One, we have to understand the church essentials, the sliver in the middle that all churches have to do. We have to master the things that every church has to do. Secondly, we have to understand how small churches function and how all small churches function the same, so that we as small church pastors, we can share resources and ideas with each other. So we have to know the church principles, we have to know the small church principles, and then thirdly, we have to understand how to function and operate and lead our congregation in a way different than any other congregation on the face of the earth. Now, don't jump to that third one too quickly. I've talked to too many small church pastors who go, oh, our church is just different, none of that applies to us. No, that's not true. There will be universal principles that you can learn from anybody, and there will be small church principles that you can learn from other small churches. You got to master those first, because otherwise you just think you're just weird, and it turns out, wait a minute, you may be weird in the same way as a lot of other small churches. You won't know that until you understand the universals and the universal small stuff, and then you can look at it and go, but my church is different in this way and that way, and then you can gain some understanding. So when you do that, that's when you start learning a few more things. You get that understanding, and then you can start leaning into this. The reason this changes is because of something called the law of large numbers. This is a sociological phenomenon that I came across a few years ago, and it really helped me understand in pastoring my small congregation. The law of large numbers states this. It's this. The law of large numbers is, the bigger the crowd, the more predictably they behave. The bigger the crowd, the more predictably they behave. This is how every polling company works. As an example, when they want to survey a group of people about their political opinion or about, what kind of food they like or whatever, the pollsters go out and they have three basic rules. They have to ask the right question of the right demographic mix, and then thirdly, they have to ask a minimum sample size of people. You can't just ask two people and add several zeros for 2,000. It doesn't work that way. If you want to know how a group, a city of 1 million feels about something, you've got to interview a minimum of 1,000 or 2,000 people, again, with the right question and with the right demographic mix. But if you don't have a minimum sample size, you can't just add zeros. Why? Law of large numbers. Once you get a big enough crowd, then there's some predictability in adding or subtracting zeros. So as an example, in church leadership context, if you pastor a church of 2,000, and you go to a church leadership conference where you're hearing from a pastor who pastors a church of 20,000, you can take almost everything that pastor says, drop a zero, and do it in your church. Why? Because your Venn diagram circles are almost completely overlapping. You at 2,000 are above minimum sample size. So if they're talking in a church of 20,000 about parking lot issues or about multiple age departments and so on, you've got same parking lot issues just with a zero removed. You've got multiple age departments just with a zero removed, okay? So you can do it because you're above minimum sample size. The law of large numbers says you can transfer those ideas. So you think, okay, so if 20,000 to 2,000, just drop a zero and do it, then 20,000 to 2,000 to 200, just drop two zeros and do it. No. Doesn't work that way anymore. Why? Because 200 is below minimum sample size. It doesn't work anymore. So at 20,000, if they're talking about parking lot issues, and you're in a church of 20, you may look at it and go, you guys have a parking lot? Like, right? They're talking about staffing. You guys have a staff, multiple departments. You guys have multiple departments, right? Everything changes when you're in a smaller congregation because you're beneath minimum sample size. That's not a statement about your quality or your value. That is just simply how the numbers work. So 20,000 down to 2,000, drop a zero, do the same stuff. 2,000 down to 200, you can't just drop a zero anymore because it's a different type of thing. And 200 down to 50, it's different again. And then, here's the deal. You can take two churches of 50. They can be of the same denomination, in the same town, on the same street, and you might as well be on two different planets. Why? Because they have 50 different people than they have. Now, I know a church of 2,000 over here has 2,000 different people than a church of 2,000 over here. But when you're at that size, it's more about crowd management than it is about the effect of individual personalities. That's the law of large numbers kicking in. The predictability kicks in because we're dealing with crowds rather than the impact of individual personalities. Two groups of 50, very, very different. Why? Because in this group of 50, when they lose one family, there goes their entire children's ministries department. I mean, they didn't just take the leaders, they took all the kids with them, right? That's what happens in a church of 50. And in this church of 50, when that one person that we all love doesn't happen to show up at church one Sunday morning, we all breathe a little easier because now we're not going to have that awkward confrontation in the lobby this week at least. Now, I know if you're in a small church, don't think you're above this because right now you've got a name and a face in mind. You know exactly who I'm talking about. Why? Here's the rule. Every church has one. And if your church doesn't have one, some other poor church has two. That's just the way it is. Everybody's assigned one of those. Now, the pastor of a church of 2,000 has one of those interesting folks as well, but that just means they get a weird email once a week. That's not a big deal. But in a church of 50, that person can ruin your Sunday. That person can drive you out of ministry. That person can split your church. In a smaller group, individual people have much bigger impact. So this now leads to point number 3, which is also the reverse side of the law of large numbers. So let's review it again. Law of large numbers, the bigger the crowd, the more predictably they behave. So it becomes more about principles and ideas. Now we get to point number 3. We need to understand and use the unique DNA of our small church for God's glory. This is the little circles inside the big circle about small churches, the way that your church is different from any other church on the face of the earth. And to understand it, we have to look at the flip side of the law of large numbers. So again, law of large numbers, the bigger the crowd, the more predictably it behaves. Flip side of that is this. The smaller the crowd, the more impact each person has for good and for bad. Now, we've already talked about the bad, that challenging person who can ruin your Sunday. Well, what's the good? Well, the good is that every person matters a lot. In fact, when you ask people, and I've done this a lot over the last few years, when you ask small church attenders why they attend a small church, top 2 reasons are this. Reason number 1, the pastor knows my name. Reason number 2, they need me here. And there's a whole lot of people who can be needed and used, and their gifts can be utilized in a small congregation, and it can't be used the same way in a larger congregation. Everybody matters a lot, and that's one of the reasons people often choose to go to a smaller congregation, because they can have a bigger impact. As an example, a few years ago, my wife Shelley and I were traveling, and we went to a larger congregation. And here's the deal also, when we are traveling and speaking at conferences, when we know we're going to a really large church, we have certain expectations about parking, about the greeting area, about the gift basket they're going to give, about the green room. And every time we go to a big church, all those expectations are met and sometimes exceeded. But when we're going to a conference and it's going to be at a small church, we look at each other like, who knows what we're going to find? It could be anything when you land in a small congregation. That's part of the charm. That's also part of the challenge of the smaller congregation, okay? So we were at this large congregation, and the pastor of the congregation was actually an old friend of mine, and they had just done a huge upgrade of the facility. And he was proud of it and wanted to show me around. So he showed me around, and they had moved a few walls, they had painted everything, they got a graphic design team in to give them a whole new graphic look and changed all the signage. They had an architectural and design team come in and do stuff. They spent $250,000 to upgrade a congregation of about 2,000 people, which lands at about like $100 a person. So it was actually pretty good use of their money. And it wasn't fancy, it was necessary, and they did it really, really well. But then as we were driving home, I was thinking, you know what? That's great. What he did was wonderful. In a big church of 2,000 people, you do a huge upgrade to the facility. You need to hire an architect, you need to hire a designer, and you need to hire a graphics design team, or you may have them on staff. But it needs to be done by professionals. In the average small church, though, that's not how it's done. In the average small church, you want to upgrade the facility, here's how it's done. In your small congregation, you've got a couple ladies who know how to decorate their house nicely. And 4 times a year, they go into the attic or the basement or the back shed, and they pull out the stuff for Christmas, for Easter, for the summer, for the fall. And they go through it, they put it out on a table, and they toss the stuff that broke since last year. And they go to the local Walmart and they pick up some stuff to replace it, and they decorate the lobby and they decorate the sanctuary, and everybody comes in and it looks so beautiful for the fall or so beautiful for Christmas, and everybody's grateful for the work that they did, and those women get to contribute to the life and health and beauty of the congregation. They could not utilize that gift in my friend's large church. That's not a dig against my friend's large church. That's not a dig against those women. Some gifts fit in a larger context. Some gifts fit in a smaller context. And one of the reasons a lot of people choose to go to a smaller congregation is because their gifts fit that. They have a greater impact because the church is small. So what do? We look around and we go, why is my church so weird? Why do I have this Apollo 13 table mess of stuff? Well, God knows who you've got on your table. God knows the resources that they have. Don't run away from it. Lean into it. Find the unique gifts that are within your congregation and make sure they're used for God's glory. So there are big differences between big churches and small churches. Let me walk you through another parallel, 3-point parallel. First of all, when big church leaders talk about leadership, big church leaders prioritize systems, processes, and programs. They prioritize processes, systems, and programs. I remember going to a church conference at a big congregation several years ago, and I was talking to a small church friend during a break, and he says, man, every time I go to a conference lately, they're talking about all these programs and all this stuff. Do we think the world's going to be saved by the latest program? I said, no, that's not what he's thinking. It's just that, take a look around. If you've got an IKEA-sized church, and you've got multiple venues and multiple services, and the video has to match in this place to that place, if you don't have precise systems and processes and programs, the whole thing falls to pieces. You've got to have it the bigger a church is. Now, small churches need to have good processes, good systems, and good programs too, but that's not what they emphasize. In a small church, the leaders spend far more of their time talking about relationships, culture, and history. So in a big church, the leaders talk about process, systems, and programs. In a small church, leaders talk about relationships, culture, and history. Let me walk you through each of those 3 things. First of all, relationships. When I talk to small church pastors, I'm often asked, do you recommend a good discipleship curriculum? And my answer is always the same, whatever works for you. Now, how can I be so nonchalant about such an important thing like discipleship in the church? Here's how. The most important way you can disciple anybody, the best system ever designed for discipleship, is the system used by Jesus, by the Apostle Paul, and by all the early disciples. And it wasn't a curriculum that you can buy in a store. What they used was something so old it's become new again, and it's this: mentoring. Mentoring is how Jesus discipled his disciples, how Paul brought along disciples, how all of the early church brought along disciples, mentoring. And at the center of mentoring is relationship. You cannot mentor and truly disciple people without relationship being at its core. Now, big churches understand this, which is why they're always emphasizing small groups and ministry teams, because they know that's where the relationship takes place. The difference in a small church is that the pastor is going to have a more hands-on approach to the relational mentoring of people. It doesn't mean you have to sit down over cups of coffee with every individual in your church one at a time. You'll wear yourself out. But you can do it in small groups, and you mentor a group of disciples, and you teach them then how to mentor the next group. We've been in our congregation almost 30 years. We are now talking 4 or 5 generations deep of people that I mentored, who mentored someone else, who mentored someone else, who are now mentoring brand new Christians. because that's how it goes over the generations through the years. But relationships are key. And as you're leading a small church, you're going to be involved in more of the mentoring relationships rather than having others do it. Too many of our small churches think we're doing discipleship, but in fact, all we're doing is getting people to finish classes. If your church is too curriculum heavy and you're not leaning on mentoring and relationships, you're not discipling, you're just teaching. And teaching is valuable, but discipleship has relationship as its core. Curriculum can be helpful. In a mentoring relationship, you can often give them curriculum to guide them along. It'll keep them between proper theological guardrails, and it'll give them proper time stamps so that they don't spend too much time in certain places that they shouldn't. So curriculum can be helpful, but mentoring has relationship at its core. And in a smaller congregation, the pastor will participate in more of the relational mentoring and discipleship than in a bigger congregation. Not better, not worse. That's just simply the nature of size. So relationships. Second thing that small church leaders talk a lot differently than our big church friends about is culture. Culture. Now, when I talk about culture, we have to define it first of all, because everybody hears that word and has a different idea. When some people think culture, they think, oh, this church over here is formal and that church is informal. They wear suits and ties. The other one shows up in flip-flops. That's not culture. That's style. That's surface. Culture is beneath the surface. Here's what culture is. Culture is the unwritten set of rules that governs everything a church does. The unwritten set of rules that governs everything a church does. So whenever a church says, well, that's just the way we do it here, that's a statement of culture. Whenever a church says, we're not doing it that way, not in this church, that's a statement of culture. Often, the strongest culture enforcers in your church have no idea they're enforcing culture. They're just doing it the way it's always been done. Now, in a big church, the pastor and staff set the culture. So most of the time, if you're going to go to a big church conference or read a book by a big church pastor, you will hear things like, Pastor, you've got to set the culture, you've got to establish the culture, you've got to push that culture through. If you are in a small church, and especially if you are new and young to that small church, and you go in and you try to establish and force a culture onto that church, God bless you at your next church. That is not going to work, especially if you are new and young, and especially if that church has been around for a while and there's a lot of seniors in it. The more you add to that, the more forcing a culture upon them is just going to bite you in the back. It's not going to work. So what do? How do we adjust a culture in a small church differently? There's a 3-step process. Here's how it goes. In a small church, and again, this applies more if you are young and if you are new, and if the church has been around for a while, and if the members of that congregation are older. The more of those things are true, the more these 3 steps matter. First of all, you have to understand the culture. You have to understand the culture. In a big church, because of the size, they're establishing culture all of their own. But in a small church, especially in a church that's rotated pastors, they've got a culture. And if you don't figure it out, you're going to be in trouble. So first of all, you have to understand the culture. Secondly, you have to show them what you appreciate about the culture. Now, in some churches, that's going to take some digging. Right? I've had some small church pastors after hearing that and going, what if there's nothing about the culture that's good? Like, then dig a little deeper. You got to find something in there. Don't lie, but you got to find, there's something, okay? So you got to understand the culture. Secondly, you have to show them what you appreciate about the culture. And then thirdly, after you do that, then they will, here's an important sentence, it's got multiple qualifiers on it. They will then give you limited permission to participate with them in moving the culture forward. So let me go through that again. You understand the culture, you show them what you appreciate about the culture, and then they will give you limited permission to participate with them in moving the culture forward. And again, the younger you are, the newer you are, the older the church is and the longer the church has been around, the more that applies. They have a culture already. They've seen pastors come and go. They've seen this big idea is going to change everything and have it go nowhere. So if they don't know that you understand it and appreciate it, you get nothing. But the best you're going to get in most small congregations is that you get to participate with them in moving the culture forward. Now, that will change over years, but it can take longer in a small church. For an example, we've been in our congregation now almost 29 years. So we don't need to run everything through everybody now. They trust us, they love us, they know us, they respect our decisions, and we can move it forward. But we had to earn that through years. Okay, so relationships, then culture, and then third big thing that we have to talk about in a small church that's different than a big church is history. History. Small towns have long memories, and so do small churches. So in a lot of small churches, if you are pastoring it, you may feel like the history of this church is actually your biggest problem. If you're in a congregation where the history of your church feels more like an anchor weighing you down than a foundation on which you can build, believe me, I understand. I've been there. So I don't know your congregation, so I'm going to just tell you the story from our congregation of how the Lord helped us to overcome that. This year, our congregation celebrates 60 years. At our 50th anniversary 10 years ago, we decided to have a big celebration. We got out old bulletins and old photos and old things, and we put them all over a big display table. And as I was looking at this display table, I noticed a piece from an old newspaper back from just a couple years after our church launched. And the headline of the local newspaper about our young church 50 years before was this. The headline was, "The church can work with delinquents," which, okay, if you're under 40, delinquent doesn't mean they're late in paying their bills. Back in the day, when kids were making a mess in the community, we called them juvenile delinquents. Today, we call them at-risk youth. That's a much better term. But back then, we called them juvenile delinquents. So this article was about a caseworker. In fact, here's the first sentence of the article, the first paragraph of the article. "As an institutional caseworker and probation officer, I searched for many months for a church really concerned about the needs of juvenile delinquents. Until recently, I could find none." He then goes on to tell about how he connected with this brand new church in this little town of Fountain Valley that has said, "We want to reach youth and we're willing to work with you about it, on it, and we're willing to bring at-risk youth in, kids that have, that are making a mess in the community, and we don't believe that it's going to turn our church into a crime-ridden area by bringing these kids in. We believe we can be a light in a dark place and we can bless them." And he spends 3 pages talking about the founding pastor of our church deciding that we're going to do new things in a new way to reach a new generation. And I took a picture of that article because as I was reading it, about 100 yards to my right in our already too small parking lot, over 15 years ago, we built the only skateboard park in town. Why did we do that? Well, about 15, maybe 20 years ago now, we resurfaced the parking lot, and all of a sudden there was noise outside and there were a bunch of skateboarders outside because now we had the smoothest surface in town. At the same time, our youth pastor was already feeling a burden for how to bring in the youth of the town and was really feeling a need to want to build a skateboard park and didn't have the nerve to talk to me, his pastor, about it yet. But after the skateboarders showed up anyway, we looked at each other and we had this conversation and we realized, okay, we've got one of 2 choices. We can either buy a bunch of no skateboarding signs or we can put up some ramps. They're already on the facility. And we decided right then that churches on defense put up signs and churches on offense put up ramps. So we created the only skateboard park, still today, the only skateboard park in our town. It still operates, it still functions, and over the last 20 years, more kids have come to Christ, more of their families have come to know Christ because the kid decided they wanted to go to the skateboard park, and during the break from the skateboard park, they had a service and they heard about Jesus. More souls have come to Christ through our skateboard park than through anything else we've done in the last 20 years because we decided we're going to be on offense. And we're going to reach out to these kids. And so I took that picture because I thought if anybody ever comes along to me and says, "I can't believe you have a skateboard park in the holy place of a parking lot of a church," I'm going to hold that out to them and go, "Really?" Because the founders of our church said that the church can work with delinquents. Because people are going to think, "Oh, you're going against the founders of our church. Our founders would be appalled with that." No, they wouldn't be appalled with that. They were the first ones to do this. In fact, when you here's the deal. In your small church, if you're having a hard time fighting the history of your church because people keep coming to you and going, "Oh, the founders of our church wouldn't have done it that way," don't run away from the founding. Go deeper into it. If you go into your church's founding documents, you will not find a document that says, "We are opening this church so that we can worship Jesus on this color of carpet until Jesus comes again." You will not find that in the founding documents. What you will find is pioneering statements because pioneers start churches. So don't do what your founders did. Think like your founders thought. And that will change everything. If you start thinking like your founders thought, you can actually begin to use the foundation of your church as a structure on which to build rather than as an anchor that pulls us all down. So in a small congregation, we have to acknowledge the history. We have to understand the people who went before. In bigger churches, they're creating their own history. There's like a gravitational pull like the size of Jupiter in a very large church. But in a small church, we're part of a process and we're really tied to that process. We need to understand the relationship dynamic within the congregation and how to utilize people. We need to understand the culture surrounding it, what people will accept and what they won't accept, how we can be a part of that, and how we can help them lead that culture to a better place. And we need to acknowledge that we are part of a great history. But one of the wonderful things about being in the church is this. We're not just telling our own stories. The story we're telling is God's story. Take a look at the Bible again, from Genesis to Revelation. It is the story of God creating a people, of that people breaking God's design, and then the rest of the Bible is God's redemptive plan to bring us back to himself. And your congregation, no matter how big or small it is, gets to play a part in the greatest story that has been or ever will be told, the story of the redemption of mankind back to the God who made us. Those are the relationships that matter. That's the culture that you're a part of, and that's the history in whose stream you're swimming. I pray that God will continue to guide you as you and your congregation go forward into an amazing future built on a wonderful history telling God's story again. Thanks.
All right, welcome back. Again, Karl, another mind-blowing, awesome training. Thank you for doing that. One of my favorite parts is when you talked about Apollo 13. I mean, that's, I went to film school, so like for me, like as soon as you start talking about movies, I got super energized, and I love that analogy of what's on that table. And I think, in my experience with the pastors, it's always like, what's in your hand? I'm always trying to remind them what's in your hand, and what can we do with that? And so, can you talk a little bit more about that, like helping people not like be discouraged? And I know Dale also said something about, about looking at that and sometimes feeling a little disappointed.
Yeah. I mean, you think about it. Nobody starts with all the ingredients on the table that they want. Jeff Bezos did not start Amazon with everything in place. He was, Steve Jobs did not start Apple that way. Rick Warren did not start Saddleback that way. You can't find anybody who built anything who started with all the money they needed and everything in place. In fact, if you take a look at those who did, who maybe inherited stuff, quite often they've squandered it more than they've actually capitalized on it. So nobody starts with all the right ingredients. Everybody's got to scramble with what they've got in front of them. But when you understand that we are not telling our story, we are a part of the story that God is telling. God knows what he's doing. When Jesus said, I will build my church, Jesus knows what he's doing. So if he's given me this assignment and these ingredients to participate with him in the building of his church, that's not a mistake, that's by design. And so I have to lean into that rather than complain about it. And complaining about it gets me nowhere. Leaning into it can create something out of it that I look at it and go, well, that had to have been God, because I couldn't have done that with that mess.
Absolutely. It does so much affirming in your own heart when, I don't know if you've ever had this experience when you were preaching or not, but there are times when I've actually preached messages where it's like, and this is, I guess it's weird to say, but it's like an out-of-body experience where you go, wow, that is good stuff, where you want to get off the stage and off the platform and go down and go forward in the altar call, because it's all God. He's the one that's speaking through you. He's the one communicating through you. And I think what happens to us at times, we get to a place where we accept the mantle of his presence and his guidance, but then he doesn't move as fast as we want him to. And so we have to kind of help him when we speed things up.
Well, tell me about a moment when you looked at the table, right? Like there's a table in front of you in your season. How did you process through what's in your hand?
I'm so weird this way because I just always felt like everything that was wrong was my fault. I mean, I don't know if anybody's wired like me. It's just like if you and I are in a relationship and it falls apart, then I go, what did I do wrong? If Karl and I have a division, I go, what did I do? I was always blaming myself. And so one of the things that really was very difficult for me pastoring is when couples would split up. I would think, well, if I communicated better, if I was a better preacher, or if I could hear from the Spirit more. And so I've always put all this pressure on myself that it took me in my 50s and going through quadruple bypass surgery and some other experiences to finally go, you know what? God's not mad at me because I'm not responsible for those people. It took me a long time to figure that out.
Well, that's why both of us have ended up counseling.
Yeah.
What has been the common theme so far? Ministry will put you into counseling.
Yes. Well, the thing that happened for me too, though, is like recently I went on a sabbatical, and during that sabbatical, we had an experience where our family got caught in a rip current and got pulled out to sea, and I almost drowned. Well, that's the second time in 15 years that I've almost drowned. So after this one, I was broken. I literally, on the emotional inside, and I did not understand that trauma is just as real and just as effective to you as if you had a physical injury, if I'd cut my arm off. But I didn't know that, because especially as pastors, we're always been told, hey, buck up and be strong, and don't let those kind of things bother you. And so I called my friend Bob Hamp, and I just said, hey, can you work me in your into the counseling, because I need to sit on the couch. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we discovered as we were talking and as I was sitting on the couch is that my theme song for life was Dale's got the whole world in his hands. It's like I begin to see in every relationship, I feel like I'm responsible for making it work, for holding everybody together. And Bob helped me to understand, hey, Dale, it's not that way. And what happened was, in the midst of our Riptide experience, my youngest daughter was a few feet away from me, and I couldn't save her. Mm-hmm. That helped me to understand, what? A lot of our pastors are in the same boat. Well, we've put so much pressure on ourselves. We feel so much responsibility for how our congregation's marriages turn out, or how the church goes, that we've just about severed the connection with hearing from God at all. And so I reached this place where I just had to come clean before the Lord.
Yeah, and I think there is a stigma. It's been societal for a while, but it is really extreme in many churches. There's a stigma to the idea of going to seek help, to going to seek counseling. And especially for a pastor, it's exponentially more. The idea that you would sit down in a counselor's office just seems like, well, you're not being spiritual. You're not going to the Lord for this. Well, no, God gave us the body of Christ, and some of us are ears. And so when I'm broken and I've got something on the inside that I need help with, I need to talk to somebody who's got those open ears. It's part of how the body of Christ is given to us to function with us. We as pastors are okay with other people coming and seeking counseling from us. Yeah. So if it's okay for them to do with me, why is it not okay for me to do with another counselor? And so, but that took me a while. It was actually in my counseling before that, this difficult season that I went through, where somebody was really ashamed to come in for counseling, and I was like, come on, there's no shame in it. And he actually looked at me and says, have you ever gone into counseling? And I had to answer honestly, no, I never have. And it made it hard to really let them know it was okay for them to, because if you haven't, why should I go? And that kind of, I didn't rush into counseling right away, but it triggered something in me that made me go, okay, I need to not be closed to this if and when I come to the point where I need it.
We have blind spots. Yeah. Everybody's got blind spots. Everyone watching, you have blind spots. And the wild thing about a blind spot is you're the only person who can't see it. Mm-hmm. And usually your family can see it, those around you can see it. And I love, and I think it's okay for you to go here. In your counseling, one of the things you discovered, really a basic thing that was going on in you, it was a blind spot to you as you were trying to lead. Do you mind sharing that?
Yeah, no, not at all. When I was in, I think it was second or third session, at one point, the counselor looked at me and just said, just almost exasperated with me, because all I was doing was whining and complaining. I was like, "You're paid to listen to this. You should not be exasperated with me." He wasn't actually exasperated, but he said it. He looked at me just straight up and said, "Karl, what do you want?" Yeah. And like you were saying earlier.
And how long had you been pastoring when he asked you this question?
Over 30 years.
Over 30 years,
yeah.
Okay.
And like you were saying earlier, where you say something in a sermon and you step back and you can look at it and go, well, that was pretty good. This happened to me in the same way. He asked that question, and without thinking, just coming out of my face, I felt these words were falling out of my face. And I looked at him and I said, I have to figure out how to fall in love with Jesus again. Mm. And he wisely just let that sit. Mm. Yeah. And we just sat with that for a moment. And I realized, I'm the Ephesian church in the book of Revelation. I've lost my first love. Yeah. I've been so busy doing stuff for him, and that I haven't been spending time with him. Yeah. And I was serving out of an empty well. Yeah. You can't continue to serve out unless you are filling up again. And there's only so much that you can fill up with by reading more stuff and getting more ideas and getting systems in place. There's only so much that can help. If you're trying to build that, you're building it on a shaky foundation. It's Jesus' parable of the wise and foolish builder. Yep. I was trying to build this great monument, and it kept falling to pieces. I was like, what's wrong? I've got to maybe do better with the drywall. I got to fix the studs. No, you got to be putting out a better foundation. Yes. And the foundation, I had not allowed the foundation to stay on Christ. and I was trying to build it on all these ideas and then getting mad at the people who were giving me all of these construction tips, going, what's wrong with them? They're giving me bad construction tips. It wasn't bad construction tips. It was good construction tips on a faulty foundation. And that changed everything.
Hey, Sam, one of the things that happened to me during the Riptide experience was a man that I didn't know came and saved me. He came and brought a boogie board. But by the time that I had been fighting the waves and going through that experience, I was exhausted to the point that people actually had to help carry me. And then the experience led to me being on a backboard in the back of a truck, in an ambulance, going to spend some time at the emergency room because I was literally, completely, physically exhausted. They gave me 6 potassium pills. They put an IV in me, and I was at a place where I couldn't do anything. And one of the things that my counselor said that helped me was, he said, so Dale, what we've discovered as we looked over your life is the times that you couldn't do anything were the times Jesus came for you through for you the most. And I think when we get so busy performing, when we get so busy doing our ministry that we forget Jesus, we get to this place to where the only way we're really going to get back on track again is to allow Him to give us an IV, to allow Him to give us the nutrients we need to build our body back up. And look, I was at a point, I was so exhausted, I couldn't have done anything else. I think a lot of our pastors are there today.
Well, and it goes back to the stigma, right? There's no stigma. Nobody heard your story and was going, well, if you'd been stronger, you should have been able to walk to that ambulance by yourself, right? No, everybody gets.
Even if they said it, I couldn't have.
Right, exactly, right? But there's no stigma attached to the physical collapse. Yes. Everybody understands it. Out in the ocean, almost died, brought you back in again, you needed to be on that backboard. But when that happens to us emotionally, spiritually, there's a stigma attached to it that somehow we should just be able to gin it up ourselves. And we need just as much help emotionally and spiritually when we're an emotional and spiritual wreck as you needed physically when you were a physical wreck. And there should be zero stigma attached to that.
The pandemic has created so much trauma in us emotionally as leaders, and it's not going to heal itself. It's not going to solve itself. You talked on one of our podcasts we did at 95 Network about the effects of trauma on us, and so you can't just move on. It's kind of like as a kid, one of the things I loved to do as a kid in elementary school was play the tetherball. You know, it's the pole with the string and the ball, and the whole goal is to wind it tight. That's where thousands, if not millions, of leaders are right now. We are wound tight, and we need to let the Lord unwind us.
Yeah. Well, I have a very similar story too, and I ended up in the hospital as a young leader, stepping into ministry for the first time. And about 5 years in, they thought I was having a heart attack, and this was in my 30s. And they put me in an ambulance, drove me to the hospital, spent about 2 weeks in the hospital trying to figure out what was wrong with me. And I think
what was wrong with you?
The ministry, vocation, right?
That's what my heart surgeon said.
Exactly. And I think I get a chance to talk with a lot of young leaders, and one things I'm always encouraging them to do is let's not lead out of scarcity, but lead out of the overflow. And I think that's really important. Yeah. And just to kind of give you a practical way, and this is how I've been kind of sharing with our young leaders, is that you need your 3. You need your mentor who's pouring into you. You need someone that's your peer that's walking with you, that understands the situation, and you need to be pouring into others. And so I always ask you, who's your 3? If you can't name your 3, and most pastors, they can't name their 3, right? They could name like their congregation and how many people they're preaching to, but how many people are they walking with? Yeah. And so those are some things that it's super important, because as givers, as counselors, as those that are constantly pouring out, for some reason, we just don't know how to receive. And that's what I'm learning.
It requires transparency. I remember when I was pastoring, there were so many times that I would lay on the floor in my office and cry because I wanted a friend. Now, it wasn't because I didn't have a great marriage or great kids, but I didn't want to bring all the trouble of ministry home. And I had a great board, but I discovered over time that most of my board members wanted to be my friend. And I actually tried to open up and be transparent with one day, and he freaked completely out. I go, well, I'm never doing that again. Yeah. And so I didn't, as a leader, I just didn't pursue it. And it's not going to, what you just described is what we need to do, but it's not just going to fall in our lap. Yeah. We've got to pursue it.
And when we do it at first, we'll do it badly. So don't let one or two bad experiences scare you away from the whole thing.
Absolutely. Like we say, healthy leaders are required for healthy churches. Yep. And so, and it's not just physically healthy, but just overall wholeness, right?
Absolutely.
Well, again, another great conversation, another great training. And like we said before, we always want to equip you and we want to train you. But I think especially with our Q&A and our time in the conversation, I think it'd be really great for you to, again, pray a prayer of encouragement to our pastors who are probably resonating with a lot of things that we're saying. And it's okay for the helper to get help, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it okay for us to say also, and I know Karl feels this way too, if you want to reach out to us, and we'll show you how to do that, but we want to help you. We're here for you. As long as we have breath in us, we want to pour into you.
Yeah. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for every servant. And Lord, I pray especially now for the broken ones, for those who are maybe even haven't been able to acknowledge it to themselves yet, or haven't been able to open up to a spouse or to a friend. I pray, Lord Jesus, that we would find our rest, our hope, and our healing in you. But help us, Lord Jesus, to take that first step of admitting our weakness, of knowing that we need that help, and finding someone who you can use to speak health and hope and healing into your broken servants. Lord Jesus, however big their church is, however successful their church may seem, is secondary to the fact that you love them and you want the best for them, for their home, for their family, and for their life. I thank you, Jesus, for every servant, and I pray for hope, for wholeness, and for healing for every single one of them. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen, amen. And so we got one more next week with our dear friend Dale. And so don't miss it. Join us. I'll see you next week.